Welcome back. Before you drift off, if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you know. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The weight of silence light bleeds through Glenwood winters like a wound, refusing to heal. In Oakhaven, where Victorian homes squat beneath leaden skies, Eleanor Vance spent her days wrapped in memories as thick as the wool afghans her mother had crocheted decades ago. She'd lived in this house, a weathered Queen Anne with more creaks than conversations, since 1969, when Arthur had still been alive and their son, Thomas, filled the halls with laughter. Now, in her 78th year, Eleanor had developed a peculiar relationship with silence. She noticed its textures, the hollow quiet of early mornings, the drowsy stillness of afternoon sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the heavy hush that descended after midnight when the old house seemed to hold its breath. Today's silence had an expectant quality, like the pause before an orchestra begins to play. The house itself had become a kind of companion over the years. She knew its moods, its seasonal shifts. In winter, the bathroom pipes complained like arthritic joints, a feeling she understood all too well. Spring brought new leaks to discover. Summer made the wood swell until the back door needed a firm shoulder to close. And autumn filled the gutters with leaves that Arthur would have cleared away before they became a problem. Every crack and crevice held some memory of the life they'd built here, the family they'd been, the losses that had shaped them. She sat in what she still called Arthur's chair, though her husband had been gone for 18 years now, working on the Sunday crossword puzzle she'd saved for Wednesday, a ritual. Like so many others, she'd accumulated small anchors against the tide of time. Outside, the February wind rattled bare branches against windows that needed washing. She'd get to that in the spring, she told herself, knowing she probably wouldn't. The radiator in the corner sighed and pinged, a sound that always reminded her of Thomas tapping his spoon against a cereal bowl, eager to start another day of second grade. She'd learned to live with such memories, to let them wash over her like waves without drowning in them. 53 years was long enough to develop certain defenses, even against grief. Her pencil hovered over 23 across, what we seek in darkness. The answer could have been lost time or cold hope or any number of things the clue didn't intend. Before she could decide, she found herself staring at the wall calendar, still showing January, though February was well underway. Thomas had always been the one to flip the pages for her, standing on tiptoe to reach "It's a new month, Mama," he'd announce, as if discovering something miraculous. The memories sparked others, as memories tend to do when you've lived long enough. The way he'd arrange his peas in perfect circles on his plate, his serious expression when helping her water the houseplants, carefully counting drops so none would get too much. The time he'd tried to teach their old cat arithmetic by drawing numbers in the air with a piece of string. The front hall mirror, original to the house, Arthur had proudly told her when they'd first moved in, caught the one afternoon light in a way that always made her reflection seem slightly wrong, as if she were looking at someone standing just behind herself. She'd meant to replace it years ago, but like so many things, it had become part of the house's character, its peculiarities. Sometimes she caught herself avoiding it, especially in the hours when day bled into evening. Today, though, something about it drew her attention. Perhaps it was the way the light fell, or maybe just her mind playing tricks. But she could have sworn she saw movement in its depths, like a child running past an open doorway. She turned, of course, found nothing, and chided herself for letting imagination get the better of her at her age. The telephone's rings sliced through her contemplation, sharp and sudden as a thunderclap in clear skies. Eleanor didn't hurry to answer it. At her age, few calls were truly urgent, usually just William checking in, or the church ladies organizing another potluck. She marked her place in the puzzle with a torn envelope and made her way to the kitchen, where the old rotary phone hung on the wall like a black spider in its web. On her way, she passed the collection of photos that marched up the staircase wall, a visual history of their family, her wedding day, Arthur looking impossibly young in his father's suit, Thomas's first steps, captured in a blurry snapshot, William's graduation from high school, then college. She'd arranged them chronologically, but there was that terrible gap between Thomas at 7 and the first photos of William as a baby. 18 years of nothing but absence. Hello. She cradled the receiver, arthritis-gnarled fingers pressing it close. The line crackled with static, reminding her of the time Thomas had tried to make a telephone from 2 tin cans and a string. He'd been so disappointed when it didn't work, but had immediately started planning improvements. That had been his way, always looking forward, always imagining better versions of things. A sob crackled through the line, so raw and young it made her chest ache. Grandma, the voice, hit her like a physical blow. William, her grandson, lived in Boston now, pursuing his doctorate in architecture. They spoke every Sunday at precisely 6 o'clock, a schedule he'd maintained since leaving for college 8 years ago. But this was Wednesday, barely past 3 o'clock, and something in that voice set off warning bells in the back of her mind. I'm lost, the voice quavered. Everything looks wrong. The streets keep changing. Eleanor's heart clenched. She'd heard fear in William's voice before, when he'd broken his arm at 12, when his first serious girlfriend left him at 20, but never this kind of bone-deep terror. Her fingers tightened on the receiver until her knuckles whitened. Sweetheart? Where are you? What do you see around you? Trees. Old houses. But they're not right. They keep shifting. Another sob, this one catching on something that might have been a laugh or a scream. I'm so cold, Grandma. So cold. The shadows. They're moving. She was already reaching for her coat with a free hand, her mind racing through possibilities. William had never been prone to confusion or panic. He was the steady one, the planner, the boy who'd grown into a man who kept spreadsheets of his daily routine. He'd inherited that from Arthur, that need to organize the world into manageable pieces. Stay exactly where you are, she said, fighting to keep her voice calm. The coat slipped from her trembling fingers. Tell me what street static devoured his words, a sound like insects chittering between worlds. No, not insects, something else. Something that made her think of the spaces between floorboards, of the dark corners in the basement where children feared to look. The line went dead. Her fingers trembled as she punched in William's cell number, each rotation of the dial seeming to take hours. The sound it made, the mechanical clicking, reminded her, suddenly, viscerally, of the sound Thomas's bicycle chain had made the morning he disappeared. Click, 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 as he rode circles in the driveway, practicing for a race that would never come. 1 ring, 2, 3, hi, Grandma. His voice was cheerful, clear. Background noise suggested a busy coffee shop, the familiar sounds of normal life that suddenly seemed as distant as another world. Everything okay? You never call on Wednesdays. The relief that flooded through her lasted only moments before. Ice began creeping up her spine. William, weren't you just finishing up some work at the library? Want me to call you back later? She sank into her chair, suddenly aware of how the afternoon light had taken on a sickly cast, how the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be. The wallpaper, faded roses that had once been Arthur's mother's pride, appeared to writhe in her peripheral vision, patterns shifting like things trying to emerge. No, that's fine, dear. I must have been confused about something. Her voice sounded strange in her ears, as if coming from very far away, or perhaps from very long ago. It reminded her of how she'd sounded in those first terrible days after Thomas vanished, when she'd had to explain over and over to well-meaning neighbors that no, There was no news, no leads, no hope to speak of yet. After hanging up, Eleanor sat motionless, listening to the house's familiar creaks and groans. But now they seemed to carry whispers, echoes of grief she'd thought long buried. The sound of the wind through the eaves had changed, becoming something almost rhythmic, almost like words. She found herself straining to understand them, then forced herself to stop. Some things were better left unheard. Her eyes drifted to the worn steps leading to the second floor, where photographs chronicled her family's history in frozen moments of joy. The afternoon light caught the glass of each frame differently, creating the unsettling impression that the images were moving, shifting ever so slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. The one that drew her gaze like a magnet hung halfway up, Thomas, her only child, forever 7 years old, in his school picture. She still remembered the morning it was taken, how she'd combed his hair 3 times because he couldn't sit still, excited about showing off his new sweater, how he'd promised to keep it clean all day, then come home with chocolate milk down the front. The thing made a sound like breaking glass and rotting leaves, like children crying in dark places. The shadows convulsed, and for a single heartbeat, Eleanor saw something vast and ancient thrashing behind the veil of reality, a glimpse of whatever dark dimension had been reaching through the thin places into her world. Then it was gone, leaving only the winter night and the empty porch. She slammed the door and threw every lock, then sank to the floor, shaking. Upstairs, she heard floorboards creak in Thomas's room, and she knew with dreadful certainty that this wasn't over. The creature had tasted her grief, had learned to mimic voices that could break her heart. It would try again, but Eleanor Vance had spent 53 years building walls around her pain, learning to live with questions that had no answers. She would not let some dark thing use that pain as a door into this world. She would guard her threshold, protect her memories, and keep faith with the sweet boy who had once played in her garden. Let the darkness come. Let it wear 1,000 stolen faces. She would be ready. In the morning, she called William and asked him to visit. Some battles weren't meant to be fought alone, and as she waited for him, she began taking down the photographs, not to hide them, but to place them where they could give her strength. Thomas's face, the real Thomas, smiling from every surface, a reminder of what she was protecting and why. She could never let that thing cross her threshold. The telephone rang again that afternoon. Eleanor let it ring. "Rest in peace, my darling boy," she thought, touching the last photograph before placing it in its new spot, facing the front door. Let no shadows wear your smile. Outside, snow began to fall, thick and silent as secrets. Eleanor made herself a cup of tea and settled into Arthur's chair, watching the darkness gather. Ready. Story 2. Emily, the first time Amelia heard laughter. In the empty attic, she dismissed it as the peculiar acoustics of an old house settling. She was used to strange sounds by then, the soft creak of century-old floorboards expanding in the sun, the whisper of wind through imperfect window seals, the gentle tap of tree branches against weathered siding. The second time, 2 weeks later, she blamed it on the wind whistling through some undiscovered gap in the Victorian home's aging eaves. The third time, when winter's early darkness had begun creeping into the afternoons, she developed a talent for explanations that even she knew rang hollow, like excuses offered in the dark hours before dawn. By the 10th time, as autumn painted the countryside in shades of fire and rust, she had stopped counting altogether. It became easier to ignore the sound than to acknowledge its growing frequency or the way it sometimes seemed to harmonize with her daughter's voice. But now, standing in that same attic with an impossible photograph trembling in her hands, Amelia could no longer sustain the careful architecture of denial she had constructed over the past 6 months. The sepia print's edges were ragged, its surface mottled. with the copper-colored age spots that old photographs develop like a slow disease. Yet the figures captured in its fading amber light remained sharp enough to steal her breath. A family of 4 stood before a bay window, her bay window, though the photograph must have been taken when William McKinley was president. The parents wore the stiff, formal clothes of another era, their faces bearing that stern, unsmiling look common to photographs from a time when capturing an image was a serious undertaking. Between them stood a boy of perhaps 12, his expression carefully neutral, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested hours of maternal correction. But it was the 4th figure that made Amelia's hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the photograph. Standing slightly apart from the family group was a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She wore a high-collared dress, her pale face framed by dark hair pulled back severely from her face. The girl's features were identical to those of Amelia's daughter, Clara. The same wide-set eyes, the same delicate nose, the same small, solemn mouth. Even the slight tilt of her head matched the way Clara had begun holding herself in recent months. The attic air grew thick around her, pressing against her skin like a living thing. From somewhere below came the sound of Clara's laughter, followed by another child's giggle that made Amelia's skin crawl. She knew her daughter was alone in the house. She was always alone, except for her new friend, except for Emily. The move to Oak Haven, Connecticut, had seemed like the answer to Amelia's prayers when she first discovered the listing that April morning, her laptop screen glowing in the pre-dawn darkness of her Boston apartment. The quiet town embodied everything she'd hoped for when she decided to leave the city after the divorce. Quiet streets lined with ancient maples that had witnessed a century of seasons. A main street that looked like a film set for a movie about simpler times, and the kind of deeply rooted history that spoke of permanence and stability, things her daughter desperately needed after watching her parents' marriage crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. The divorce itself had been civil enough on the surface, but Amelia knew better than most how deceptive surfaces could be. Daniel had moved out on a Tuesday morning in March, leaving behind half-empty closets and a daughter who stopped speaking for nearly 3 weeks. Clara had sat at her window each evening, watching the street with an intensity that broke Amelia's heart, though she never said what or who she was waiting for. Sometimes Amelia would find her daughter's room empty in the morning, only to discover Clara had spent the night curled up in her father's old reading chair, clutching one of his forgotten sweaters. The house on Chestnut Street had captured her imagination immediately. A Victorian painted lady with good bones and a price that seemed too reasonable to pass up, even factoring in the work it clearly needed. The real estate agent, a thin woman named Mrs. Gable, with anxious eyes and hands that never quite stopped moving, had shown them through the rooms on a grey October afternoon when the light seemed reluctant to enter the tall windows. "It has an attic, Mummy," Clara had exclaimed during that first viewing, her face lighting up with the kind of genuine excitement Amelia hadn't seen since before the separation. A real attic, like in books. Mrs. Gable's reaction had been subtle but immediate. A slight stiffening of her shoulders, a quick darting of those nervous eyes toward the ceiling. She had quickly steered them toward the kitchen to discuss the updated appliances, her voice taking on the too bright tone of someone determined to change the subject. But Clara had continued to crane her neck toward the ceiling, searching for signs of the attic access with an intensity that, in retrospect, should have given Amelia pause. At the time, though, Amelia had taken her daughter's enthusiasm as a positive sign. After months of watching Clara withdraw into herself, speaking in monosyllables and picking listlessly at her food, any spark of interest felt like a gift from whatever gods watched over divorced mothers and their wounded children. Later, during the closing process, Amelia had noticed other oddities. The previous owners had moved out with unusual haste, leaving behind furniture they claimed wouldn't fit their new home. Mrs. Gable's typically chatty demeanor turned evasive whenever Amelia asked about the house's history. The property disclosure forms contained peculiar gaps, sections filled out with carefully worded phrases that managed to say nothing while implying everything. But the price was right, and Clara's enthusiasm never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger with each visit, until she was practically vibrating with excitement the day they finally moved in. Amelia had attributed it to the natural appeal of a big old house to an imaginative child. After all, what 7-year-old wouldn't be enchanted by curved banisters, window seats, and mysterious doors that led to unexpected places? And now, standing in that same attic 6 months later, Amelia wondered if she should have paid more attention to Mrs. Gable's discomfort, should have asked more questions about the house's history, should have noticed how the previous owners' disclosure forms skated over certain details with carefully worded vagueness, should have wondered why 3 different families had owned the house in the past decade, none staying longer than 18 months. The first few weeks had gone well enough. Clara had seemed to bloom in the new environment, spending hours exploring the house's nooks and crannies with the detailed attention only a 7-year-old can muster. She made maps of the rooms in her careful child's handwriting, marking spots she declared interesting with red crayon stars. Most of those stars clustered around the attic. The attic itself had required significant cleaning before Amelia would allow Clara to play there. Years of accumulated dust had coated every surface, and the air had carried a peculiar sweetness that reminded Amelia of dried flowers and old perfume. She'd spent a full weekend up there, sorting through abandoned belongings and sweeping away cobwebs that seemed to reappear as soon as she turned her back. When Clara first mentioned Emily, Amelia hadn't worried. The literature on children and divorce was clear on this point. Imaginary friends were a normal coping mechanism, particularly for only children processing major life changes. The divorce had been hard on Clara. If she needed to create a companion to help her cope, Amelia wouldn't discourage it. But Emily wasn't quite like other imaginary friends, was she? Amelia's fingers tightened around the photograph as memories from the past months flickered through her mind like images from a broken film projector. The changes had been so gradual that she had almost convinced herself they weren't happening at all. Almost. It started with Clara's speech patterns. Small things at first. An unusual word choice here, a formally structured sentence there. The kind of things that might make a mother proudly think her child had been reading above her grade level. But the changes accumulated, like snow building, into something that could no longer be ignored. One simply doesn't wear ribbons with this style of collar, Clara had announced one morning, smoothing her newly severe hairstyle with hands that moved in unfamiliar patterns. Emily says it simply isn't done. The toys had appeared next, materializing in Clara's room like artifacts surfacing in disturbed soil. First came the porcelain doll with unsettlingly realistic glass eyes, its cream-colored dress yellowed with age. Amelia had found it sitting on Clara's dresser one morning in late November, though she knew with absolute certainty she'd cleared the attic of all such items during their initial cleaning. The doll's face wore a serene expression that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, its painted lips either smiling or frowning, depending on how the light struck them. "Emily gave her to me," Clara had said when questioned, her voice taking on that dreamy quality that had become increasingly common. "She says I'm ready to take proper care of her things now, just like the others were." Something in her daughter's phrasing made Amelia's skin prickle, but Clara had already turned away, humming a tune Amelia almost recognized from somewhere very long ago. More toys followed, each appearing without explanation or source. A tin soldier with a painted uniform whose colors matched no army Amelia could identify stood guard on Clara's windowsill, His tiny rifle pointed not outward at imaginary enemies, but inward toward the room. A mechanical monkey whose clockwork innards produced a discordant tune that set her teeth on edge appeared on the bookshelf, its brass key turning slowly on its own when no one was watching. A miniature tea set with delicate hand-painted roses materialized in the corner cabinet. Roses whose thorns somehow drew drops of blood, no matter how carefully one handled the cups, leaving rust-colored stains that never quite washed away. Each time, Clara had the same explanation. They were Emily's toys, shared with her special friend. Each time, Amelia searched the attic, but found no source for these antique playthings. They seemed to materialize from the house's shadows, each one carrying the weight of decades in its worn surfaces and faded colors. Amelia began to notice other changes in her daughter. Clara's movements became more deliberate, her gestures carrying a grace that seemed borrowed from another time. She developed peculiar habits, insisting on wearing he-collared dresses, taking her tea with milk but no sugar, arranging her hair with methodical precision each morning. Small things, perhaps, but they added up to something that made Amelia's maternal instincts scream in warning. Then came the knowledge. Things Clara couldn't possibly know, yet spoke of with casual certainty. Daddy cried for weeks when he lost his purple rabbit at the park when he was little, Clara had said one morning over breakfast, stirring her oatmeal in perfect concentric circles. Emily says it made him sad for years and years. He used to dream about finding it, but he never did. Amelia had nearly dropped her coffee cup. Her ex-husband had never mentioned any lost toy from his childhood, but when she'd called to ask him about it, his shocked silence had confirmed the truth. How could Clara have known that? That had been the first incident, but not the last. Clara began speaking of things she couldn't have known about the house, about the town, about their own family history. Each revelation came wrapped in the same explanation, Emily told me. The revelations grew darker as winter settled over Oakhaven, spreading its white shroud across the town. Clara spoke of deaths that had occurred in the house, of secrets buried in walls, of children who had lived there and then vanished without explanation. Her stories emerged in fragments, usually at twilight, when the shadows began their slow dance across the walls. "Did you know about the twins?" she asked one evening. In December, her fingers tracing patterns on the frosted window pane. "The ones who lived here in 1923. Emily says they loved to play hide-and-seek." Clara's reflection smiled in the glass, but something about the expression made Amelia's chest tighten. They were very good at hiding. So good that no one ever found them. Amelia tried to research these stories, but the town's historical records proved surprisingly incomplete. Files had been lost, newspapers from certain years were missing, and long-time residents grew uncomfortable. When she asked too many questions, Mrs. Gable at the Historical Society would change the subject. Whenever Amelia mentioned the house on Chestnut Street, Mr. Jennings, who'd lived next door for 60 years, suddenly became hard of hearing when she tried to ask about previous residents. Even the local library seemed to resist her investigations. Books about town history would be mysteriously misshelved when she looked for them, and the microfiche reader invariably broke down whenever she tried to access newspapers from certain years. The librarian, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, who bore an unsettling resemblance to Mrs. Gable, would only say that some things were better left in the past. The house itself seemed to change around them, though Amelia would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly how. Rooms felt different at different times of day. The dimensions subtly altered when viewed from certain angles. The parlor grew longer in the afternoon, stretching away from the windows like a shadow reaching for darkness. The kitchen seemed to shrank in the mornings, its walls pressing inward until Amelia could barely breathe, only to expand again when she looked away. The attic, in particular, seemed to follow rules of space and dimension that Amelia's mind refused to fully comprehend. On cloudy days, its corners retreated into shadows that didn't quite match the angle of the sun outside. The round window that faced east sometimes appeared to face west, though Amelia could never catch the moment of transition. The ceiling beams shifted positions between visits, forming patterns that made her eyes hurt if she looked at them too long. Small objects began to migrate when no one was looking, following paths that seemed to mock the laws of physics and probability. Amelia would place her keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them in the attic, hours later, dust-free but cold to the touch. Clara's school books would vanish from her backpack and reappear on the top shelf of her closet, their pages marked with pressed flowers Amelia had never seen in their garden, pale blooms that seemed to glow faintly into the dark and smelled of ancient perfume. Time itself began to move strangely within the house's walls. Clocks would run backward for hours at a time, their hands moving with deliberate purpose against their nature. The antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3 o'clock 4 times one afternoon, each chime coming from a slightly different location, despite the clock never moving from its corner. Sometimes Amelia would look up from her work to find that entire afternoons had passed in what felt like minutes, while other times the space between tick and tock stretched like pulled taffy, seconds expanding into small eternities. Winter gave way to spring with a reluctance that seemed to mirror the house's growing hold on them. Clara spent less and less time outdoors, despite the warming days and brightening sun. She preferred to stay in the attic, having long conversations with Emily that Amelia could sometimes hear through the floor of her bedroom. The voices would continue long after she'd put Clara to bed, though the words were never quite clear enough to make out. They reminded Amelia of the sound of pages turning in a very old book, or the whisper of silk against stone. Clara's changes became more pronounced as the days lengthened. Her movements took on an unsettling grace, each gesture precise and deliberate as a dancer in an ancient ceremony. She developed habits that seemed pulled from another century, taking afternoon tea with exact precision, correcting Amelia's table manners with gentle disapproval, folding her clothes in complex patterns that Amelia would find impossible to replicate. "One must maintain standards," Clara would say, her voice carrying echoes of someone else's intonation. "Emily says proper behavior is the mark of a refined soul." The morning Amelia found Clara meticulously polishing the silver at 5 a.m., humming a waltz that had last been popular in 1890. Something inside her finally broke. Her daughter's small hands moved with practiced efficiency, following patterns learned from someone who had last drawn breath when Victoria was queen. The silver service itself was another mystery. Amelia had never bought it, had never seen it before that morning, yet Clara handled each piece with familiar care. "The roses need extra attention," Clara said, without looking up, her voice distant and dreamy. "Emily says the thorns must be kept sharp, or they won't serve their purpose. The lady who lived here before the war used to cry at night," Clara had mentioned while colouring one rainy afternoon. "Emily says she lost her baby and never had another one. That's why she painted the nursery black before she left." Amelia had dismissed it as macabre imagination until she'd found the evidence herself. A layer of black paint beneath the cheerful yellow she'd chosen for Clara's room, the discovery sending chills down her spine. The sound of footsteps overhead drew Amelia's attention back to the present. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The attic floor creaked above her head, but she was in the attic. There was nowhere higher for anyone to walk. The footsteps moved again, this time accompanied by a child's laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Amelia spun in place, the photograph clutched to her chest. The late afternoon light filtering through the attic's round window had taken on a strange quality, too thick and yellow, like light trapped in amber. "Clara," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. The laughter came again, but this time it sounded wrong. Too many voices layered together, like a choir of children all slightly out of sync. Amelia stumbled backward, her heel catching on something solid. She looked down to find an old steamer trunk she didn't remember seeing before. Its brass fixtures were dark with age, its leather covering cracked and peeling. As she watched, the trunk's lid slowly began to rise. Now, standing in the attic with the photograph in her hands and the strange trunk at her feet, Amelia forced herself to look more closely at the image. The girl in the photograph, the one who wore her daughter's face, stood apart from her family in a way that seemed deliberate, almost staged. Her eyes held something that didn't belong in a child's gaze, a patient, calculating intelligence that made Amelia's skin crawl. The trunk's lid continued to rise with agonizing slowness. From within came the sound of something shifting, something much larger than the trunk's dimensions should have allowed. "Mummy," Clara's voice called from downstairs. But there was something wrong with it, a hollow quality, as if it were coming from very far away. "Mummy, Emily wants to show you something important." Amelia's fingers brushed against writing on the back of the photograph. She turned it over, her hands shaking so badly she could barely make out the faded inscription, "The Harrison family, 1891. Edward, Mary, William, and Emily." Visiting, the last word, had been underlined several times, the pen strokes sharp and aggressive. Below it, in different handwriting that looked unsettlingly fresh, were more words. "She comes to visit. She always comes to visit, but she never leaves alone." The trunk lid slammed fully open with a sound like a thunderclap. Amelia stumbled backward, the photograph falling from her nerveless fingers. From within the trunk rose a figure that should not have fit inside, the form of a young girl in a high-collared dress, her dark hair pulled severely back from her pale face. She moved with the fluid grace of smoke, her feet never quite touching the floor. "Do you like what I've done with her?" the figure asked in a voice that contained echoes of 1,000 children's voices. "You're Clara. She's almost ready now. Almost. Perfect." The entity that called itself Emily smiled, revealing teeth that were old yellowed things. "Just like all the others were almost perfect. But she's the closest match yet." "Clara," Amelia called out, her voice breaking. "Clara, where are you?" "Oh, she's here," Emily said, drifting closer. Her form flickered like a candle flame, sometimes appearing as the girl from the photograph, sometimes as something far older and more terrible. "She's always been here. All of them have been here. Would you like to see?" The trunk's interior suddenly seemed to stretch downward into impossible depths. Amelia caught glimpses of small, pale faces in the darkness, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each wearing the same expression of patient, hungry anticipation. Each one bore some resemblance to the girl in the photograph, though none had achieved the perfect mimicry that Clara's features now displayed. "They weren't quite right," Emily said, her voice full of ancient sadness. "But Clara, oh Clara's special. When the change is complete, she'll be perfect. A perfect echo. A perfect companion." The spirit's form wavered again, revealing something beneath its childlike appearance that made Amelia's mind recoil. "And you'll have the comfort of knowing she'll never be lonely again. She'll stay here with me, just like all the others. Forever and ever and ever." From somewhere far below came the sound of Clara's footsteps on the stairs, climbing slowly toward the attic. But the steps sounded wrong now, too heavy, too purposeful, not like a child's steps at all. "Mummy," Clara's voice called again, closer now. "Emily says it's time. Emily says I'm ready." The attic door began to open. Story 3. The routine had become as natural to Mrs. Gable as breathing, though she would later struggle to pinpoint precisely when it began. She suspected it might have been shortly after Walter's funeral, during those first bewildering weeks when time seemed to lose all meaning, flowing like treacle one moment and racing past the next. The distinction between sleeping and waking had grown peculiarly thin then, and she had taken to walking early in the morning, when the world felt somehow more substantial, more real. Each morning she would wake precisely at 6:17, a time that held no particular significance she could recall, yet seemed impossibly important, and performed her ablutions with methodical care. The ritual of it was soothing, washing her face with cold water, arranging her steel-grey hair in its customary style, selecting one of her carefully pressed blouses. The final touch was always her worn mackintosh, regardless of the weather. The walk itself followed an equally precise route. From her flat on Willow Creek Lane, she would make her way past the old mills that had given the street its name, their iron-stained stones bearing silent witness to centuries of local history. Then up Mill Street, where the morning workers were, just beginning to unlock shop doors and raise metal shutters, their movements carrying the drowsy automatism of long habit. The route took her through the winding paths of Oakhaven Park proper, where dawn light filtered through ancient oaks in ways that never quite matched her memories of previous mornings, past the murky waters of the duck pond, where ducks traced meaningless patterns on the surface and occasionally dove for reasons known only to themselves. Finally, after exactly 27 minutes of walking, she had timed it once, though she couldn't now remember why. She would reach the derelict bus stop on Northridge Road. The stop itself was a curious anomaly, a relic that seemed to exist outside of regular maintenance schedules and transit authority records. Mrs. Gable had once attempted to look up its status, spending an afternoon at the local library poring over transit maps and route histories, only to find conflicting information. According to one document, the stop had been decommissioned in 1983. Another listed it as pending review. Since 1979, a third made no mention of it at all, though it detailed every other stop along Northridge Road with pedantic precision. The physical structure bore similar contradictions. The schedule board had been stripped bare, save for a few defiant scraps of laminated paper, their text long since bleached illegible by sun and rain. Yet the bench, a sturdy iron affair with art, deco flourishes, showed no sign of rust or wear, despite the region's notorious weather. The concrete platform was neither cracked nor stained, and no weeds grew through its seams, though the surrounding pavement was riddled with both Dot and then there was him. Every morning, without fail, he would be there, ramrod straight, in his impeccable charcoal suit, pocket square, perfectly arranged, gleaming Oxfords unmarred by the perpetual drizzle. His appearance never varied in the slightest detail. The same three-piece suit, the same sterling silver tie-pin, the same immaculate black leather briefcase resting beside his right foot. Even the angle at which he stood seemed precisely calculated, as though he were a figure in a technical drawing rather than a living man. She had taken to calling him the passenger in her mind, though she knew this was something of a misnomer. In all the months she had observed him, not once had she seen him board a bus. Indeed, no bus ever seemed to stop there any more, save for the occasional out-of-service vehicle, whose driver had pulled over to consult a map or take a hurried cigarette break. These drivers never acknowledged the passenger's presence, though Mrs. Gable noticed they never stayed long and their hands shook slightly as they restarted their engines. The passenger simply stood, unwavering, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the ancient oaks that lined the road. His stillness was absolute, almost artificial, like one of those living statues that populated tourist areas, though Mrs. Gable had never seen one quite so convincing, nor so unsettling in its perfection. There was something in his pose that suggested not just stillness, but an absence of the need to move, as though motion itself were a concept foreign to his nature. She had tried speaking to him once, early on, when the morning isolation and her own loneliness had momentarily overwhelmed her natural reserve. A cheerful good morning that died in the air between them, absorbed by the peculiar quality of silence that seemed to surround him like an invisible barrier. The words had felt wrong even as she spoke them, like trying to make polite conversation. In a cathedral during Mass, or laughing at a funeral after that singular attempt, she had relegated herself to furtive glances as she passed, telling herself that her growing obsession with the strange figure was merely the natural result of too much time alone since Walter's passing. Yet even as she formed these rationalizations, she knew them for the convenient fictions they were. There was something more here, something that tugged at the edges of her understanding like a half-remembered dream. She began to notice other details, small discrepancies that seemed insignificant in isolation, but formed a disturbing pattern when considered together. The way morning fog seemed to avoid him, leaving a perfect circle of clarity in which he stood. How the fallen leaves that littered the pavement never quite reached his feet, as though some invisible force held them at bay. The curious fact that she had never seen him arrive at or depart from his post. He was simply there each morning, and then, presumably, not there at some point after she had passed. Most troubling of all were the changes she began to notice in herself. Her morning walks, once a healthy response to widowhood, had taken on the character of a compulsion. She found herself unable to vary her route or timing, growing anxious if anything delayed her usual departure. Her dreams became populated with bus stops and schedules, with endless waits for vehicles that never arrived. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, she could hear the distant sound of diesel engines and the hiss of air brakes. Though no buses ran on Willow Creek Lane, the weather had turned unseasonably cold for September, when the first real change occurred. The morning had started normally enough, though the fog was thicker than usual, reducing the park to indistinct shapes that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Mrs. Gable had dressed with her usual care, noting absently that her blouse, the pale blue one Walter had always favoured, seemed looser than she remembered. The walk had proceeded according to routine until she reached the duck pond. There, something made her pause. The pond's surface was perfectly still, unusual for a morning that elsewhere showed signs of a brisk wind. As she watched, a single ripple appeared in the center, expanding outward in concentric circles that seemed to move too slowly, as though the water had become viscous. When the ripples reached the shore, she noticed that the wavelets didn't break naturally against the bank, but instead reversed direction, creating a pattern that momentarily resembled nothing so much as the spokes of an enormous wheel. The sight disturbed her in a way she couldn't articulate, and she hurried on toward the bus stop, her comfortable shoes making no sound on the damp pavement. The passenger was in his usual place, but something was different. His head was inclined slightly, no more than a fraction of a degree from its usual position. But the change was as shocking to Mrs. Gable as if he had suddenly begun to dance. It was then that she noticed his reflection in a puddle near his feet. While the passenger himself remained perfectly still, his reflection seemed to move independently, turning its head to follow her progress along the pavement. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once observed. Mrs. Gable found herself unable to look away, even as her mind struggled to process this impossibility. The incident left her shaken, and that afternoon found her seeking refuge in the local library, ostensibly researching her family genealogy, though in truth she found the warm, dusty atmosphere more comforting than her empty flat. The library had always been a sanctuary, its tall windows filtering the autumn light into something softer, more manageable. The microfiche reader hummed quietly in its corner, a sound that reminded her of earlier days when Walter would spend hours researching obscure historical topics. His enthusiasm for detail something she had both loved and gently mocked. It was while paging through microfiche copies of the local paper that she first saw his face. The photograph was grainy, as news photos from 1979 tended to be, but there was no mistaking those sharp features, that rigid posture. City broker among victims in tragic bus accident, the headline declared. The article went on to detail how a bus had lost control on an icy patch, careening through the barrier on Northridge Road and plunging down the embankment. There had been no survivors. Mrs. Gable sat very still for a long time after reading this, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the viewing screen. The rational part of her mind, the part that still balanced checkbooks and remembered to water her African violets, insisted there must be some mistake, perhaps a resemblance, nothing more. But she knew with the same inexplicable certainty that tells us we are being watched in an empty room that the man in the photograph was her passenger. She did not sleep that night, her thoughts churning like autumn leaves in a gutter. By morning, she had convinced herself that confrontation was the only path forward. Whatever this thing was, ghost, hallucination, or something else entirely, she would face it directly. One particularly cold morning in late December, Mrs. Gable noticed that her wristwatch, Walter's last gift to her, had begun to behave oddly. The second hand would occasionally move backward for brief intervals, or skip forward in irregular jumps. She took it to 3 different jewelers, but none could find anything mechanically wrong with it. The third jeweler, an elderly man with thick glasses and trembling hands, had examined it for nearly an hour before handing it back with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Some watches, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, develop peculiar habits, like living. Things you understand. They become acclimated to certain patterns of time. He had refused to elaborate further, but as she left his shop, she heard him muttering something about his grandfather's experiences as a railway timekeeper and the strange behaviors of station clocks just before accidents. The incident with the watch marked the beginning of what Mrs. Gable would later think of as the dissolution period, though at the time she had no name for the subtle wrongness that began to pervade her days. Her morning walks took on a dreamlike quality, with familiar landmarks appearing in impossible orders or impossible places. She would find herself passing the same tree 3 or 4 times, though she had maintained a straight path. The duck pond seemed to change size and shape daily, its waters sometimes reflecting a sky that bore no relation to the one overhead. The passenger, too, began to exhibit new behaviors, though behaviors was perhaps the wrong word for such minimal changes. His customary stillness remained, but now it seemed to extend beyond his physical form, creating patches of unnatural calm in the air around him. Birds would fall silent as they flew overhead, and the ever-present traffic noise became muted and distant within a certain radius of his position. Most troubling were the moments when he appeared to occupy multiple positions simultaneously, not moving between them, but somehow existing in 2 or 3 places at once, each version identical down to the angle of his tie-pin. She began to notice others watching him as well, not the regular morning commuters who seemed as blind to his presence as ever, but different observers who would appear at odd moments. A woman in a nurse's uniform that might have been current during the Second World War, standing motionless behind a tree. A young man in the distinctive clothes of the 1960s, perpetually tying his shoelace on a distant bench. An elderly gentleman in Victorian dress endlessly adjusting his pocket watch, while half hidden in the shadow of the park's ancient oaks. None of these figures ever acknowledged Mrs. Gable directly, but she had the distinct impression they were aware of her attention. Her research at the library took on a more focused quality. She began tracking weather patterns associated with disappearances in the area, noting correlations with unusual astronomical events and variations in bus route schedules. The librarians no longer brought her tea, though she occasionally found cups of it cooling at her elbow, with no memory of their arrival. Her notebooks multiplied, their margins filling with calculations and diagrams that seemed perfectly logical while she was drawing them, but became indecipherable hours later. It was during this period that she began to notice changes in her flat as well. The layout remained the same, but distances between rooms seemed to vary unpredictably. The hallway to her bedroom might require 15 steps one evening and 23 the next. Objects would shift positions when she wasn't looking directly at them, though always in subtle ways that could almost be attributed to poor memory. Walter's photographs, particularly, seemed resistant to remaining in one place, and their contents began to change in minor but disturbing ways. In one, his tie would be blue instead of the red she remembered. In another, he appeared to be standing at a bus stop she recognized with increasing certainty as the one on Northridge Road. The breaking point came on a morning in early January, when the temperature had dropped well below freezing and an unusual fog had settled over the town. Mrs. Gable had woken at her usual time to find her wristwatch showing 8:47, though the quality of light through her windows suggested a much earlier hour. The watch had resisted all attempts to adjust it, the crown spinning freely without affecting the position of the hands. As she performed her morning routine, she became aware of subtle differences in her surroundings. The water from her taps ran slightly too slowly, as though fighting against some invisible resistance. The mirror above her bathroom sink showed reflections that lagged noticeably behind her. Movements and occasionally included figures standing behind her that vanished. When she turned to look, her clothing, laid out the night before, seemed to have aged decades overnight, though it remained perfectly preserved, as though it had existed in some other time stream, before being returned to her present. The walk to the bus stop that morning felt simultaneously longer and shorter than usual. The streets were empty of both people and vehicles, though she could hear the sounds of traffic and conversation just at the edge of audibility. The fog seemed to move with purpose, forming patterns that suggested architectural features from different periods of the town's history. Victorian smokestacks, medieval church spires, future structures she had no context for, but recognized somehow as inevitable. When she reached the duck pond, she found it frozen solid. Despite the fact that the temperature, while cold, was nowhere near freezing point, the surface was mirror smooth, reflecting not the grey January sky above, but rather a complex pattern of intersecting bus routes, their lines glowing faintly from within the ice. As she watched, shadows moved beneath the surface, not of fish or underwater plants, but of vehicles and passengers, all seemingly engaged in endless journeys through the frozen medium. "I know who you are," she managed at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what happened to you." For the first time in all the months she had observed him, the passenger moved. The motion was smooth, almost liquid, as he turned to face her fully. His features were exactly as they had appeared in the photograph. Not a day older, yet somehow wrong in a way she couldn't quite define, like a word repeated too many times until it loses all meaning. "You missed your stop," he said, his voice carrying the peculiar quality of a distant radio broadcast. "But it's coming back around." Mrs. Gable felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. The passenger's smile widened fractionally, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too perfectly aligned. "Time is funny that way," he continued, his words taking on an echo-like quality. "It's not the straight line everyone thinks it is. More like a circle, or perhaps a Mobius strip, endlessly turning back on itself." She wanted to run, but her legs seemed to have developed the same rigid quality as the passenger's usual stance. A distant ticking sound filled her ears, growing louder with each passing second. "Walter sends his regards," the passenger said, and Mrs. Gable felt the world tilt sideways. She stumbled home somehow, though the journey remained a blur in her memory. The rest of the day passed in a fog of disjointed moments. Tea gone cold in her favorite cup, the telephone ringing unanswered, shadows lengthening across her sitting room floor in impossible directions. It was only as evening approached that she noticed her wristwatch. Walter's last gift to her had stopped. The hands were frozen at precisely 8:47, the exact time listed in the accident report from 1979. She tried winding it, but the crown simply spun freely, producing no movement in the mechanism. The sound came then, the distinctive hydraulic hiss of air brakes, followed by the idle of a diesel engine. Through her window, she could see the bus, its white paint gleaming impossibly bright. In the gathering dusk, the destination board was illuminated but empty, displaying no route number or terminus. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh. The passenger stood on the bottom step, one hand extended in welcome. Behind him, through windows that seemed to look out onto somewhere else entirely, she could see other figures. Their features were indistinct, but one of them, seated near the back, raised a hand in a familiar gesture. Walter had always waved that way, fingers splayed like a child. Mrs. Gable found herself moving toward the door of her flat, her feet carrying her forward of their own accord. The ticking in her ears had returned, but now it was accompanied by other sounds, the murmur of conversation, the rustle of newspaper pages, the quiet laughter of reunited friends. She understood now, with perfect clarity, why the passenger had waited all those months. Time might move in circles, but some circuits took longer to complete than others. Some passengers needed more time to realize they had missed their connection. The night air was cool against her face as she stepped outside. The bus idled patiently, its headlights cutting through the gathering fog like beacons. Or perhaps they were cutting through something else entirely, the thin membrane between what was and what might be, between the world of schedules and appointments, and the stranger realm that lay beyond. Mrs. Gable took a deep breath, tasting diesel fumes and something else, something older and more profound. She thought of all the mornings she had passed the passenger, all the silent exchanges that had led to this moment. Had she known, somehow, had some part of her recognized the truth from the very beginning? The passenger's hand remained extended, patient and unwavering. Behind him, the figures on the bus seemed to lean forward slightly, as though in anticipation. The ticking in her ears had reached a crescendo, drowning out all other sounds, save for the steady idle of the engine. She took a step forward, then another. The pavement beneath her feet seemed to shift and flow like water, disturbed by a passing current. Above her, the streetlights flickered and dimmed, their light receding until only the bus remained, a beacon in the growing darkness. "Better hurry," the passenger said, his voice carrying that same radio-static quality. "We wouldn't want you to miss it again." Mrs. Gable reached for his extended hand. His fingers were cool and dry, with the same peculiar smoothness she had noticed in his features. As they closed around hers, she felt a subtle shift in the world around her, as though reality itself were being gently realigned. The last thing she saw as she mounted the steps was her own reflection in the bus's side mirror, a figure in a worn mackintosh, features already beginning to take on that same perfect stillness she had observed in the passenger all those months ago. Then the doors closed with a final, decisive hiss, and the bus began to move. They say in that part of the town that sometimes in the early morning hours, when the fog rolls in from the park, you might see two figures standing at the derelict bus stop, a man in an impeccable charcoal suit and a woman in a worn mackintosh. They never speak, never move, never board any of the buses that still occasionally pass by. They simply wait, watching the road with infinite patience, perhaps looking for other passengers who have missed their stop, who need to be reminded that the route is circular and the bus always comes back around, just not always to the same town they left behind. Story 4. The uncovered mirror. On the morning of my mother's funeral, I found myself obsessively straightening the collection of silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece in our Boston home. Each one showed Mother at various ages, always standing slightly to the left of center, always wearing the same distant expression that had become so familiar in her later years. In the last photograph, taken just 6 months ago at my insistence, she had aged into someone I barely recognized, a small, suspicious woman who seemed to fold in on herself, as if trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. The house felt different that morning, though I couldn't say precisely how. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, too bright, too insistent, streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Or perhaps it was the silence, which seemed to have a weight of its own, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. Mother had never been particularly noisy, but her presence had filled the house in other ways. The soft shuffle of her slippers on hardwood floors, the whisper of pages turning in whatever book she was reading, the barely audible murmur of her voice when she talked to herself or to whatever she thought she was talking to in the attic. I had spent the past week avoiding the 3rd floor entirely, focusing instead on the more manageable tasks of death, arranging the funeral, sorting through papers, accepting covered dishes from neighbors who remembered Mother from better days. But now, with the funeral over and the last casserole safely stored in the freezer, I found myself drawn to Mother's bedroom, to the heavy mahogany jewelry box that had sat on her dresser for as long as I could remember. The box was lined with faded blue velvet, its contents arranged with the same precise attention to order that had characterized everything Mother did. Each piece had its place. The pearl necklace Grandmother had left her, the garnet brooch she wore to church, the silver charm bracelet she had added to each Christmas until I turned 16 and announced I was too old for such things. Beneath the jewelry tray, wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief that still held traces of her lavender perfume, lay a small brass key. I knew what it was immediately, though I hadn't seen it in decades. The attic key. Mother had hidden it away this summer I turned 11, after finding me up there for the 3rd time that week. Some places aren't meant for children, she had said, her voice carrying that peculiar blend of fear and authority that I would come to associate with all her prohibitions. Promise me you'll never go up there alone again. I had promised, of course. Children make promises easily, without understanding their weight. But standing in her room now, the key cool against my palm, I remembered the rules she had repeated so often. They had become a kind of liturgy. Never go up there alone. Never open the windows. And never, under any circumstances, remove the black velvet sheet from the mirror in the far corner. The stairs to the 3rd floor rose at a steep angle, each step slightly narrower than it should have been, as if the house itself were reluctant to allow access to its highest level. I stood at the bottom for several long moments, one hand resting on the banister. The wood felt warm beneath my palm, despite the autumn chill that permeated the rest of the house. Grandmother had always insisted on keeping this banister polished to a high shine, spending hours every Sunday afternoon working beeswax into the wood with patient, circular motions. The habit had passed to Mother, though in her later years she had taken to muttering under her breath as she worked, her hands moving faster and faster until the cloth sometimes slipped from her grip entirely. I began to climb slowly, testing each tread before putting my full weight on it. The sound of my sensible black pumps against the wood seemed unnaturally loud in the empty house, echoing in a way that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. Each step brought with it a memory. Mother's voice calling me down to dinner, the scrape of furniture being moved across the attic floor late at night, the soft murmur of conversations I was never meant to hear. The lock resisted at first, stiff, with disuse, but then turned with a click that seemed to ripple through the silence. The door required pressure in exactly the right spot, just above the handle, with a slight upward thrust to open. The familiar resistance brought back a rush of memories. Summer afternoons spent exploring while Mother was at church. The thrill of disobedience mixing with a deeper, stranger excitement I had never been able to name. The attic air hit me like a physical presence, thick with dust and a peculiar staleness that accumulates in long-closed rooms. Sunlight filtered through the single dormer window, creating a narrow path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beam, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost meaningful. If only I could look at them long enough to understand. The space was crowded with the physical remnants of 4 generations of my family's life, trunks and boxes. Old furniture draped in sheets, stacks of yellowing magazines tied with twine. Each object cast its own particular shadow, creating a geography of darkness that seemed to shift and change whenever I looked away. The effect was disorienting, making the familiar dimensions of the room feel somehow wrong, as if the corners didn't quite meet at right angles. I stood just inside the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The air had a peculiar weight to it, pressing against my skin like damp silk. There was a scent, too, that I couldn't quite identify, something beyond the expected mustiness of old wood and cloth. It reminded me of the way Mother's room had smelled in her final days, lavender and medication. Yes, but underneath that, something else, something that made me think of winter afternoons when the sun sets too early, of empty rooms waiting to be filled, moving carefully through the maze of stored memories. I touched things as I passed. The smooth wood of my childhood rocking horse, the rough carpet of an old steamer trunk, the cool brass of a lamp that had once stood in the front parlor. Each contact sent small clouds of dust into the air, contributing to the strange, thick quality of the atmosphere. The rocking horse's painted eye caught the light as I passed, and for a moment I could have sworn it followed my movement. But that was ridiculous, of course. The trick of light and shadow, nothing more. And there, in the furthest corner, stood the shape I had been both seeking and avoiding, tall, broad, and draped in black velvet that seemed to absorb the light that fell upon it. The mirror, it had been a constant presence in my childhood, though I had only seen it uncovered once, on a day very much like this one, when the house had been full of the particular silence that follows a funeral. I had been 7 then, and Grandmother had just died. I remembered finding Mother up here, standing before the uncovered mirror, her hand pressed against its surface, as if trying to reach through to something or someone on the other side. When she saw my reflection behind her, she had whirled around with such violence that I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of old magazines. The sound they made hitting the floor had been like gunshots in the attic's heavy silence. That was the day Mother had first laid down her rules about the attic, her voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't identify. Later, I would recognize it as fear, not the ordinary fear of a parent for a child's safety, but something deeper, more primal, the fear of something vast and incomprehensible, something that waited behind reflective surfaces with infinite patience. I remembered how, in the weeks following that incident, Mother had begun covering all the mirrors in the house at night. To let them rest, she would say when I asked, as if mirrors grew tired from reflecting. I had found her more than once standing in the hallway past midnight, methodically hanging dark cloths over every reflective surface. She would pause sometimes, head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear, before moving on to the next mirror, the next window, the next picture frame under glass dot. Standing before the mirror now, I noticed how the sheet seemed to ripple slightly, though there was no breeze in the stale attic air. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the velvet, soft, so soft, despite its years of undisturbed rest. Mother's voice echoed in my memory. Promise me you'll never uncover it, Eleanor. Some reflections are better left unseen. The rational part of my mind, the part that had chosen accounting over art, security over passion, that had slowly transformed me into the kind of woman who wore sensible pumps and kept her hair in a practical bun. Insisted that it was just a mirror, an old, probably valuable antique, but nothing more. Yet something deeper, something that remembered the look in Mother's eyes when she spoke of it, whispered that some promises were made for reasons beyond our understanding. I found myself pacing in front of the covered mirror. 5 steps left, 5 steps right, the way Mother used to pace in front of my bedroom door when I was sick with childhood fevers. The floorboards creaked in familiar patterns beneath my feet. Had they memorized our family's anxious movements over the generations? I imagined the sound traveling down through the layers of the house, through Mother's empty bedroom, through the parlor where we had hosted her wake, down into the foundations where the oldest parts of our history settled like sediment. The journal in my purse seemed to grow heavier. With each pass I made in front of the mirror, I could feel it there, pressing against my hip through the leather of my bag, as insistent as an unspoken thought. Something had compelled me to bring it up here, the same something, perhaps, that had made me slip it into my purse before leaving. For the funeral, though I hadn't yet brought myself to read more than a few scattered entries. Now, I withdrew the journal with hands that didn't feel quite steady. The leather cover was warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed some of Mother's feverish energy in her final days. A pressed flower, a dried violet perhaps, or something that had once been violet, fell from between the pages, crumbling to dust before it hit the floor. The sight made me think of Mother's garden, once so carefully tended, now overrun with weeds that looked almost purposeful in their arrangement. I opened the journal randomly, my fingers trembling slightly as they moved across the pages. Mother's handwriting shifted dramatically from entry to entry, some passages written in her usual careful script, others scrawled urgently across the page, as if she couldn't get the words out fast enough. The dates jumped erratically. March 15th, then February 3rd, then April 29th, as if she had been trying to piece together some pattern that only made sense in her increasingly fragmented mind. One passage caught my eye, the ink darker than the rest, as if she had pressed the pen down with unusual force. The mirror never shows the truth. That's what my mother told me, and what her mother told her. It shows what might have been, what could still be, what lurks beneath the surface of our choices. Eleanor doesn't understand yet. She's too young, too full of defiance. But she will learn, as I did, that some reflections are warnings, and some are prophecies, and some are hungry things that wait behind the glass, wearing our faces like masks. I traced my finger along the words, feeling the indentations her pen had left in the paper. The next few pages were blank, as if whatever she had seen in the mirror that day had silenced her for a time. Then the writing resumed, smaller now, more controlled, but with a frantic energy that made the letters blur together. I watch her. Sometimes, my Eleanor, when she thinks I'm not looking, she moves through the house like a stranger, like someone trying to avoid leaving footprints. She thinks I don't see how she glances at her reflection in windows and silverware, in the dark screen of her phone, always just a quick look, as if she's afraid of what might look back. She has her grandmother's way of turning her head just so when she passes a mirror. They never understood that avoiding reflections only makes them hunger more. The words seemed to blur and shift on the page, like the dust motes in the sunbeam, like the shadows in the corners of the room. I closed the journal with more force than necessary, the sound sharp and sudden in the thick air. My heart was beating too fast, and I could feel sweat gathering at the nape of my neck despite the attic's autumn chill. I found myself looking at my hands, really looking at them. Perhaps for the first time in years. They were Mother's hands now, the same prominent veins, the same slight tremor, the same tendency to twist together when anxious. When had that happened? When had I started holding my teacup the same way she did, tilting my head at the same angle? When listening, pursing my lips in that particular expression of disapproval that I had once sworn I would never mirror. Looking at the covered mirror again, I noticed how the shape beneath seemed different. Larger, perhaps, or closer, though I knew I hadn't taken a step. The sunbeam from the dormer window had shifted, leaving the corner in deeper shadow, but there was still enough light to see by, enough light to make choices by, or perhaps enough shadow to hide in, the way Mother had hidden, the way her mother had hidden. Generation after generation of women turning away from their own reflections. Mother was gone now, her rules buried with her beneath the New England soil, and I was 45 years old, far too old to be bound by childhood promises and superstitions. Yet, as I stood there, I found myself remembering all the small ways she had tried to protect me, the covered mirrors, the closed curtains, the way she would hurry me past shop windows on overcast days when reflections seemed somehow sharper, more attentive. My hand moved toward the velvet drape of its own accord, fingers brushing against fabric that felt almost alive, almost warm. The touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the attic's chill. Behind the fabric, something seemed to shift, to adjust itself, like a person smoothing their clothes before opening a door. The mirror that emerged was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. The frame was carved oak, darkened with age, depicting twining vines and flowers that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. The glass itself was flawless, impossibly clear for its age, reflecting the attic behind me with perfect clarity. The stacked boxes, the draped furniture, the beam of sunlight now falling at an angle that shouldn't have been possible given the window's position. But it wasn't the strange quality of the light that made my breath catch in my throat. It was my reflection. Or rather, what should have been my reflection. The woman who stared back at me was not the one I had seen in my bathroom mirror that morning. She was younger, 25 perhaps, with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders instead of my current, practical bun. She wore a green velvet dress I remembered clearly. I had worn it to my first gallery opening before I gave up painting for a sensible career in accounting. Before I became the responsible daughter Mother had always wanted. But it was more than just the physical differences that made my breath catch in my throat. There was something about her eyes, my eyes, yet not quite mine anymore. They held a clarity of purpose I had forgotten I once possessed, a defiance that had been slowly worn away by years of practical decisions and careful compromises that the young woman's expression was blank, unnaturally so. And as I raised my hand to touch the glass, she remained motionless. I remembered this moment, this exact moment, from 20 years ago, standing before the same mirror, my hand outstretched, my heart full of fierce determination. I had just sold my first painting, had just rented a small studio space in downtown Boston. The world had seemed so full of possibility then, each blank canvas, a door waiting to be opened. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her own hand, not to mirror mine, but to press her palm flat against her side of the glass. The surface, fogged beneath her touch, spreading outward from her fingers like frost on a winter window. Her breath clouded the glass further, and her finger began to move, tracing letters that appeared with terrible clarity. You promised. I watched the words form, each letter emerging as if carved in ice. The younger Mes movements were precise, deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine as she wrote. This wasn't a reflection mimicking my actions. This was memory given form, purpose given flesh. This was the self I had carefully packed away, like the paintings stacked in the corner under yellowing sheets. like the dreams I had folded and stored in boxes labeled practical considerations and reality. I stepped back, my heel catching. On an uneven floorboard, the younger me continued writing, her movements growing more frantic, each word appearing as if scratched into the surface of the glass. With diamond-sharp clarity, you promised you would never forget. You promised you would never become her. The words burned in the air between us, each letter seeming to pulse with its own internal light. I remembered that promise, remembered making it in this very spot on another autumn afternoon, when the light had fallen just so, when the air had held the same electric quality. I had stood before this mirror after Mother had tried to convince me to take that accounting job, to give up the studio, to be realistic about my future. I had sworn then that I would never let fear rule my life the way it had ruled hers. Never. Let caution steal the color from my world. Never let practicality dim the brightness of my dreams. I had sworn it with all the fierce certainty of youth, with all the righteous anger of someone who couldn't imagine ever becoming the thing they despised. My heart hammered against my ribs, its rhythm matching the trembling of my younger self's hand as she wrote. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, making the reflection waver and shift. For a moment, I saw Mother's face superimposed over my own. Not the mother of her final years, but the young woman I barely remembered from photographs. The one who had once played piano at wedding receptions, who had dreamed of performing at Carnegie Hall before responsibility and fear had turned her into someone who jumped at shadows and spoke in warnings. The journal had fallen open when I stumbled, its pages fanned out on the dusty floor like the wings of a fallen bird. My eyes caught another passage, this one dated just weeks before Mother's death. The handwriting was different here, steadier, almost peaceful, as if she had finally understood something that had eluded her for years. I should have understood. Sooner. The mirror doesn't show what we fear. It shows what we fear becoming. Each generation of our family has faced it, has made their choice. I chose fear. I chose safety. I chose to become my mother. And in doing so, I may have condemned Eleanor to the same fate. The words seemed to pulse on the page, keeping time with my heartbeat. In the mirror, my younger self had stopped writing. She stood perfectly still now, tears streaming down her face, leaving tracks that seemed to glow faintly in the impossible light. Behind her, or perhaps behind me, it was becoming difficult to tell. Shadows moved and coalesced, taking shapes that made my eyes hurt to focus on. I found myself thinking of all the times I had heard Mother up here, alone, talking in that soft, urgent voice. Had she been speaking to her own reflection, to the younger version of herself who had once dreamed of being a concert pianist before responsibility and fear had turned her into someone who jumped at shadows and spoke in warnings? The air in the attic grew thicker, charged with possibility. My reflection began to change, shifting like water, showing me glimpses of other lives. Myself at an easel, grey streaking my still long hair, teaching art to children in a sun-filled studio, standing before a gallery wall covered in vibrant canvases. Each image flickered and faded, replaced by another, while the shadows behind the glass swirled and danced like paint in water. I understood then what Mother never had. The mirror wasn't a warning or a curse. It was a reminder, a window into the self we left behind, the promises we made and broke and could perhaps remake. The realization came with a clarity that felt like waking from a long dream, or perhaps like falling into one. As I stood there, watching the versions of myself shift and change in the glass, I became aware of subtle alterations in the attic around me. The air had taken on a peculiar quality, like the moment before a summer storm when everything goes still and bright. The dust motes had stopped their dance entirely, hanging suspended as if waiting for something. Even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. My reflection steadied, resolving into my current self, but changed somehow. My practical bun was shot through with silver, my face lined with years of laughter rather than worry. Paint stained my fingers, and there was a smudge of blue across my cheek that I had never dared to allow in my accounting life. Behind me, the shadows had become recognizable. Easels, canvases, the ghosts of paintings yet to be created. They were as clear now as the boxes and furniture of the real attic, as if two worlds had briefly aligned, showing me what had always existed just beneath the surface of things. I found myself thinking of the way Mother used to describe her music. In the rare moments when she would talk about her past, it wasn't just playing notes, she would say, her fingers moving unconsciously through the air as if touching invisible keys. It was opening a door between what is and what could be. I had never quite understood what she meant until now. Watching the light shift and change in the mirror's depths, new words appeared on the glass, written not in desperate haste, but with deliberate care. It's time to keep your promise. The letters had a different quality now, not frost or fire, but something like starlight, something that spoke of possibility rather than accusation. My younger self smiled, a small, sad thing that carried all the hope I had once possessed, all the dreams I had carefully packed away in this very attic. I reached for the black velvet sheet, but I didn't cover the mirror. Instead, I let it fall to the floor, watching as dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that now fell across the glass. The velvet pooled at my feet like spilled ink, like gathered shadows, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw Mother's hands folding it carefully, away, her younger self performing the same gesture in reverse, unfolding possibilities instead of hiding them. The reflection showed me as I could be, as I might become, all possibilities existing simultaneously, like layers of paint building depth on a canvas. The mirror's surface seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly, as if it were a living thing slowly waking from a long sleep. The carved vines in the frame had begun to move more openly now, no longer pretending to be mere tricks of light and shadow. They twisted and grew, reaching toward the ceiling beams, where more shadows gathered and shifted. The attic itself seemed to be changing, responding to something in the air, or perhaps to something in me. The stacked boxes and draped furniture began to take on new forms in my peripheral vision. An old trunk's brass fittings gleamed like fresh paint on a palette. A sheet-covered chair revealed itself as an easel, waiting to be uncovered. Even the dust in the air had transformed, becoming more like particles of pigment suspended in light, waiting to settle into new patterns, new meanings. I found myself moving through the space differently now, each step deliberate, as if I were learning a dance I had forgotten I knew. The floorboards no longer creaked warnings beneath my feet, but seemed to hum with possibility. Here and there, patches of afternoon sunlight fell in shapes that reminded me of canvases I had once dreamed of painting, abstract forms that spoke of movement and emotion rather than careful, accountable reality. Mother's journal still lay open at my feet, and I could see now that the seemingly random dates of her entries formed a pattern of their own. She had been mapping something through these pages, tracking the mirror's cycles like an astronomer charting the movements of distant stars. The entries spiraled through the book, leading to that final understanding she had reached only at the end. I spent that afternoon in the attic, watching the light change as the sun moved across the sky. Each shift in illumination revealed new aspects of the space, new possibilities hidden within familiar shapes. The mirror remained uncovered, and as I worked at clearing away years of accumulated dust and neglect, I could feel it watching, not with malice or judgment, but with patient anticipation. Sometimes when I glanced at it, I saw myself as I was. Other times, I caught glimpses of other selves, other possibilities, all of them waiting, like blank canvases, for the first stroke of paint, In the deepening afternoon light, I began to uncover things I had forgotten. A box of oil paints, the tubes still soft and viable despite their years of storage. Brushes wrapped carefully in silk, their handles worn smooth by hands that had known exactly how to hold them. Canvases in various states of completion, each one a window into who I had been, who I might have become. The colors seemed more vivid than they should have been, as if they had been storing up light all these years, waiting for someone to notice. Them again, the mirror reflected each discovery with perfect clarity, but somehow altered, showing not just what was, but what could be. A half-finished landscape became a completed masterpiece. A sketch of a figure evolved into a full series of portraits. A single tube of cobalt blue transformed into an entire palette of possibilities. Behind each reflection, shadows continued to move and change, like thoughts taking shape just before they become words. Mother's last journal entry, written the day before she died, lay open before me now, the words seeming to shift and rearrange themselves as I read. The mirror shows us what we need to see, when we need to see it. I hope Eleanor understands this before it's too late, before she spends her life hiding from reflections instead of learning from them. We think we're protecting ourselves by turning away, by choosing the safer path, but some promises need to be kept. Some reflections need to be faced. Some doors need to be opened, no matter what waits on the other side. The writing changed as it continued, becoming stronger, more certain. I hear her sometimes, my younger self, still playing Chopin in empty rooms, her music echoing through the spaces between what is and what could have been. She's not angry anymore, not accusing, she's waiting. The way the mirror waits, the way art waits in blank canvases and music waits in untouched keys. She knows, as I know now, that it's never too late to keep a promise. Never too late to open a door you thought was closed forever. I stayed in the attic until midnight, surrounded by the ghosts of abandoned dreams and the promise of new ones. When I finally descended the stairs, I left the mirror uncovered. Some reflections, I had learned, need to be faced in the clear light of day, need to be studied and understood, rather than hidden away beneath black velvet and years of fear. The next morning, I gave notice at the accounting firm. By afternoon, I had enrolled in art classes at the local college, and that evening, I set up an easel in the attic, directly across from the mirror, where I could watch my reflection paint alongside me, sometimes younger, sometimes older, but always true to the promise I had made 20 years ago. Mother was right about one thing. The mirror never reflects the truth. But perhaps that's because the truth isn't found in reflections at all. It's found in the choices we make when we finally stop looking away from them. Story 5. The breathing. The first time I noticed the breathing, I dismissed it entirely. My mind was still clouded by the peculiar fog that lingers after major surgery. That liminal state where reality seems to drift just slightly out of alignment. The titanium plate in my skull was still an alien presence then, its edges occasionally catching the light in ways that made me pause mid-motion, arrested by the thought that there was now something manufactured, something deliberately engineered, residing within the architecture of my own body. This dissociative state was, after all, exactly the sort of thing Dr. Alistair had warned me about during my final consultation at St. Jude's. He had the kind of office that practically telegraphed medical authority. Leather-bound journals lined the shelves, their spines a steady march of gold-embossed neurological terminology. His desk was a massive mahogany piece that probably predated both of us, its surface marked by the careful, overlapping rings of decades of coffee cups. Post-operative recovery can be disorienting, he'd explained, leaning back in his chair, with the casual authority that comes from delivering such news 1,000 times before. The brain, he told me, often responds to trauma with a constellation of peculiar symptoms. temporal displacement, auditory phantoms, dreams that feel more substantial than waking life. He listed these possibilities with practiced precision, each potential side effect weighted with just enough gravity to command respect without inspiring undue anxiety. I nodded along, already familiar with the literature. When you work in museum conservation, as I do or did, before the incident, you develop a certain scholarly approach to everything, even your own medical conditions. I'd spent the weeks leading up to my surgery reading every journal article I could find about cranial trauma and its aftermath. The titanium plate they were going to install, I learned, had a fascinating history dating back to World War II. I found comfort in such details. My apartment on East 79th Street had always been a sanctuary of sorts, a pre-war refuge where I could surround myself with the artifacts and oddities I'd collected over years of working at the City Museum of Art. The walls were thick enough that the sounds of the city seemed to arrive as if through layers of cotton, muffled and distant. The radiators kept their own schedule, marking time with mechanical sighs that I'd grown to find almost companionable. Each room had its own particular character. The study with its overcrowded bookshelves and reading chair positioned just so to catch the afternoon light. The kitchen with its original 1920s tiles that I'd painstakingly restored. The living room with its carefully curated collection of Asian bronzes that my colleagues occasionally borrowed for comparative analysis. The bedroom, though, had always been spartanly furnished, almost monastic. Just the bed, a dresser, and the massive Victorian mirror I'd inherited from my grandmother. The mirror dominated one wall, its ornate frame featuring carved details that seemed to shift and change depending on the quality of light. I spent countless hours over the years studying those patterns, trying to decode the story they might be telling. My grandmother had claimed the mirror came from an estate sale in Boston, though she never specified which estate. Some things, she used to say, are better left unexamined too closely. Bruno, my German shepherd, had been a recent addition to this carefully curated solitude. The museum's head of security had suggested I get a dog after the attack, though he tactfully avoided using that word. The incident, he'd called it, as if by choosing a more neutral term, he could somehow soften the reality of what had happened. In the basement storage area that night, as if clinical language could erase the memory of waking up on the cold floor. Blood pooling beneath my head, surrounded by the silent witnesses of centuries-old artifacts. The security cameras had failed. That night, a fact that still bothered Detective Miller more than it did me. He'd shown me the footage multiple times. Normal activity until 2:47 a.m. Then nothing but static until the morning guard found me at 6:15. Electronics can be funny around old things, I told him, thinking of the countless times our conservation equipment had malfunctioned in the presence of certain artifacts. He hadn't appreciated that observation. The first few weeks after returning home from the hospital passed in a blur of prescription medications and follow-up appointments. Each day took on a strange, ritualistic quality. Mornings began with a careful cataloguing of my physical state in a leather-bound journal, the same type I'd once used to document newly acquired artifacts at the museum. I noted everything, the particular quality of light that seemed to linger too long in corners, the way my reflection occasionally appeared to move with a slight delay, as if transmitted from somewhere infinitely far away. The headaches came and went like unwelcome visitors, each one unique in its character, but following patterns I was slowly beginning to recognize. I developed routines, as one does when recovering from trauma. The morning pills were arranged in a precise semicircle on my bedside table. Each night, the evening medications formed a mirror image on the opposite side. Between these pharmaceutical bookends, I would pace my apartment like a curator studying an unfamiliar collection, noting subtle changes in my environment that I couldn't quite explain. books that seemed to have shifted position overnight, objects that caught the light at impossible angles, the faint but persistent scent of lily of the valley that would appear and disappear without warning or reason. Bruno adapted to our routine with remarkable efficiency. He would escort me on my prescribed daily walks, maintaining a protective proximity that somehow never felt oppressive. His presence had a grounding effect. When I found myself drifting into uncertain mental territory, his solid warmth against my leg would pull me back to the present moment. At night, he took a position by my bedroom door, his body aligned with military precision along the threshold. I found his presence reassuring, even if I sometimes caught him staring at empty corners with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. The breathing began on the 7th night after my return home. I remember this precisely, because I had just finished updating my recovery journal, noting with satisfaction that the incision site was healing nicely, and that the headaches had begun to follow a predictable pattern. The entry ended at 11:42 p.m. I was always exact about recording times. A habit formed through years of conservation work, where even minute changes in temperature or humidity needed to be documented with scientific precision. My evening routine had acquired an almost ceremonial quality by then. The medications were taken in a specific order, each pill examined under the bedside lamp before being swallowed. The windows were checked and rechecked, their latches tested with the kind of thoroughness that might have seemed obsessive to an outside observer, but when you've spent your career preserving priceless artifacts, such attention to environmental controls becomes second nature. The bedroom had begun to feel different at night. During the day, it was simply a room, Spartan but comfortable. Its few pieces of furniture arranged with careful consideration for space and function. But after sunset, something about the proportions seemed to shift, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting. The Victorian mirror took on a different character entirely in the dim light, its ornate frame casting shadows that never quite matched the objects casting them. I arranged myself carefully among the pillows that now seemed necessary for comfort, one beneath my neck, another supporting the still tender spot where the titanium plate met bone, a third tucked against my side in a position that Dr. Alistair had recommended for optimal blood flow. Bruno had already assumed his post by the door, his dark form a reassuring silhouette against the faint light from the hallway. Sleep came with surprising ease that night. Perhaps it was the new medication, dosage, or maybe simply the cumulative exhaustion of recovery. I drifted off watching the play of streetlight on the ceiling, noting how it seemed to move in patterns that didn't quite correspond to the traffic below. At exactly 3:11 a.m., I awoke to the sound of someone breathing beside my bed. The sound itself was deceptively ordinary, slow, measured inhalations and exhalations, the kind one might associate with deep meditation or sleep. What made it extraordinary was its clarity, its immediacy, and the absolute certainty that it did not belong to either myself or Bruno. The breathing had a quality that I would later struggle to describe in my journal. It was simultaneously intimate, an alien, as if the breather were standing inches from my face, yet somehow occupying a space that existed at right angles to normal reality. I kept my eyes closed, forcing myself to analyze the sound with professional detachment. The conservator in me took over, mentally cataloguing every aspect of the auditory phenomena. The breathing followed a precise rhythm, 2 seconds for inhalation, 3 for exhalation, with a half-second pause between cycles, regular as a metronome, too regular for a sleeping person, too steady for someone trying to deliberately control their breathing. My first thought was that the building's ventilation system had developed some peculiar resonance. After all, pre-war buildings were notorious for their acoustic quirks. Air moving through old pipes could produce remarkably organic sounds. But in 15 years of residence, I'd never heard anything remotely similar. Besides, the breathing had a distinctly localized quality. It was coming from a specific point in space, roughly 3 feet to my left, at approximately the height where someone's face would be if they were standing beside the bed. The possibility of an intruder seemed simultaneously the most and least likely explanation. The security system was state-of-the-art, a necessity given my occasional responsibility for housing museum pieces overnight, and Bruno's presence ruled out any conventional break-in. Yet the breathing was undeniably there, as real as the cool air flowing from the vintage radiator or the distant sound of late-night traffic on Columbus Avenue. Bruno's reaction was, in retrospect, the first indication that something truly unusual was occurring. He made no sound, no bark, no whine. But when I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, I found him rigid at his post, staring fixedly at the corner near my antique wardrobe. His lips were drawn back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth that gleamed dully in the ambient light from the street below. There was something profoundly unsettling about his silence. German shepherds are not typically quiet in the face of perceived threats. Bruno's stillness suggested something beyond ordinary canine comprehension. The breathing continued, maintaining its metronomic precision, until exactly 4:11 a.m. I know this because I watched every minute tick by on the small clock radio beside my bed, its red digits burning themselves into my retinas as I lay there, perfectly still, analyzing every aspect of the sound with the desperate thoroughness of someone trying to maintain their grip on rationality. The numbers seemed to pulse slightly with each digit change, though I told myself this was simply eye strain, a natural result of staring too long at illuminated figures in the dark. When morning finally arrived, heralded by the first tentative calls of sparrows nesting in the building's ornate cornices, I did what any scholar would do. I began to research. The building's history revealed nothing particularly noteworthy. No tragic deaths, no mysterious disappearances, none of the usual folklore that tends to accumulate around older city properties. The land records, which I accessed through a former colleague at the city archives, showed nothing more interesting than the usual progression of ownership from Dutch settlers onward. I expanded my investigation to include the surrounding neighborhood. The elderly archivist there, Mrs. Peterson, seemed increasingly concerned about my obsession with overnight incidents and respiratory phenomena. Buildings breathe, she told me one afternoon, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. They inhale and exhale with the changes in temperature and pressure. Perhaps that's all you're hearing. But her eyes didn't quite meet mine as she said it, and I noticed she locked the archives precisely at sunset each day. No matter how many researchers were still working, I might have dismissed the entire episode as a peculiarity of my recovery had it not repeated itself the following night and the next. Always at precisely 3:11 a.m., always lasting exactly 1 hour, always accompanied by Bruno's silent vigilance. The mathematical precision of it was almost as disturbing as the phenomenon itself. Nature tends toward variation, toward subtle irregularities. Only manufactured things, or things deliberately engineered, maintained such perfect timing. It was during this period that I began to notice other irregularities. The arrangement of my books would shift subtly overnight, though I lived alone, and Bruno showed no interest in my library. Volumes on temporal theory and quantum mechanics would migrate to prominent positions, despite my having no recollection of owning such texts. My carefully organized research notes would be found scattered across my desk in the morning, arranged in patterns that almost suggested meaning, like some arcane form of bibliomancy. The antique mirror I'd inherited from my grandmother, a massive Victorian piece that dominated one wall of my bedroom, seemed to reflect scenes that didn't quite match reality. At first, the discrepancies were subtle enough that I questioned my own perception. A book on my nightstand would appear slightly different in the reflection, open instead of closed, or showing a different colored bookmark. The fold of my bedsheets in the mirror didn't always match their actual arrangement. Small things easily dismissed in isolation. But as the days progressed, the inconsistencies became more pronounced. One morning, while dressing for a follow-up appointment with Dr. Alistair, I noticed that my reflections' movements seemed to anticipate my own by a fraction of a second. When I raised my arm to adjust my collar, the mirrored version of myself had already completed the gesture before I began it. The effect was so disorienting that I had to sit down on the edge of my bed, my head swimming with possibilities that my scientific training refused to acknowledge. I began documenting these temporal anomalies in a separate journal, using the same meticulous methodology I'd employed in my museum work. Each entry was dated, timed, and cross-referenced with my medication schedule, local weather conditions, and lunar phases. The researcher in me insisted there must be some pattern, some underlying logic to these events. But the more data I collected, the more unsettling the implications became. The mirror's strange behavior seemed to intensify during the breathing episodes. In the darkness at 3:11 a.m., I would sometimes catch glimpses of movement in its surface when the room was perfectly still. Shapes that suggested human figures moving in spaces that couldn't exist within the confines of my apartment. Once I was certain I saw a hospital corridor reflected in its depths, not a modern one, but something from another era entirely, with high ceilings and elaborate moldings that spoke of early 20th century architectural sensibilities. And then there was the perfume. The first time I noticed the scent of lily of the valley, I was examining my healing incision in the bathroom mirror. It came as a sudden wave of fragrance, so vivid and specific that I actually turned around, expecting to find someone standing. Behind me, the bathroom was empty, of course, but the scent lingered, carrying with it a weight of memory that nearly brought me to my knees. My mother had worn lily of the valley perfume every morning. I remembered she would carefully apply it behind her ears before disappearing into her study to work on what she called her temporal research. I had largely suppressed these memories in the decades since her disappearance, but now they came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. I recalled the growing stacks of books and papers in her study, the increasingly complex diagrams she would draw on any available surface, the way she would sometimes stop in mid-conversation and stare at nothing, as if listening to voices only. She could hear the perfume would appear without warning, lingering in odd corners of my apartment before dissipating like smoke. Sometimes it would manifest in places that made no logical sense, inside my closed wardrobe or emanating from the pages of books I hadn't opened in years. Most often, though, it seemed to concentrate around the Victorian mirror, as if the glass itself was exhaling the fragrance. I found myself drawn to the mirror during these episodes, studying my reflection with an intensity that bordered on obsession. There was something about the quality of light in the reflected room that wasn't quite right. Shadows fell at impossible angles, and sometimes I could swear I saw movement in the deeper recesses of the mirrored space, as if the reflection extended far beyond the physical confines of my bedroom. One afternoon, while examining the mirror's ornate frame for any sign of hidden mechanisms or unusual construction, I discovered a small envelope tucked behind one of the decorative corbels. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting on its face was immediately recognizable. My mother's distinctive, flowing script. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in what appeared to be mathematical equations, interspersed with fragments of text in multiple languages. At the bottom, a note. The mirror is more than a reflection. It's a window. Time pools in certain places, in certain objects. I found one. When you're ready, you'll understand. The paper trembled in my hands as I read it. The equations were unlike anything I'd encountered in my studies, but something about them resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity. They reminded me of the strange vibrations I'd sometimes feel from the titanium plate in my skull, particularly during the nighttime breathing episodes. When I held the paper up to the mirror, the reflected version appeared to show different equations, as if the mirror was revealing another layer of information hidden within my mother's calculations. Dr. Evans, from the medieval department, had become a regular visitor during my convalescence, though his appearances grew increasingly erratic. He would arrive unannounced, often at odd hours, his tweed jacket dusted with the peculiar mix of chalk and ancient paper that seemed to cling to all the museum's manuscript specialists. His official reason was always the same: keeping me updated on museum matters. But I sensed an underlying urgency in his visits that belied their supposed casualness. He found me one afternoon surrounded by medical journals and technical specifications for cranial implants, searching for something I couldn't quite articulate. The titanium plate in my skull had become an obsession of sorts. I'd traced its manufacturing history, studied its molecular structure, and begun to suspect that its precise atomic arrangement might have properties beyond its medical purpose. "The mind creates patterns," he said, carefully moving a stack of papers so he could sit in my reading chair. The leather creaked beneath him in a way that seemed to echo the building's own settling sounds. "It's what we do. We're meaning-making machines. Sometimes, after trauma, those patterns can become rather baroque." I didn't tell him about the breathing. Instead, I asked him about temporal theory, about the medieval understanding of time as something less rigid than our modern conception. He warmed to the topic immediately, as academics tend to do when presented with their specialty. The medieval mind, he explained, settling into what I recognized as his lecture pose. Fingers steepled beneath his chin, saw time as permeable, malleable, more like a fabric that could fold upon itself than a river flowing in one direction. There are manuscripts, rather obscure ones, mind you, that speak of individuals who could move between moments as easily as we move between rooms. His eyes flickered to the Victorian mirror as he spoke, and something in his expression shifted. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw recognition there, as if he, too, had noticed something unusual in its depths. But before I could press him on it, his attention caught on the camera on my desk, an old Sony Handycam I'd found while organizing my closet. "Document it," he said, his voice taking on an odd urgency. "Whatever you're experiencing, record it. Remove the mystery." He paused, then added, more quietly, "Some phenomena require objective observation to fully manifest." That night, I set up the camera on my dresser, positioning it to capture both my bed and the corner that so fascinated Bruno. The familiar rhythm of technical preparation helped steady my nerves, checking the battery, adjusting the night vision settings, ensuring the angle was correct. It was not so different from documenting a new acquisition for the museum's archives. The camera's small screen showed a perfect reflection of my bedroom in its LCD display. But when I glanced at the Victorian mirror behind it, I saw something else entirely. The same scene, but with subtle differences. In the mirror's version, the camera was already recording, a red light blinking steadily, though I hadn't yet pressed start, and in the mirror's depths, barely visible in the background, stood a figure in what appeared to be an antiquated hospital gown, watching the proceedings with patient interest. Sleep came with surprising ease, perhaps because I finally felt I was taking action, approaching the situation with proper scholarly methodology. But at 3:11 a.m., I awoke to the breathing. This time, forcing every muscle to cooperate, I opened my eyes. She stood less than a foot from my face, her features composed in an expression of such intense concentration that it bordered on rapture. Her hospital gown was anachronistic, high-necked with delicate lacework at the collar, that I immediately recognized as characteristic of the early 1920s. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that seemed to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, young and ancient, present and distant, immediate and eternal. But it was the mirror that broke my carefully maintained composure. Because while I lay paralyzed in my bed, my reflection was sitting upright, wearing what appeared to be hospital scrubs, and it was smiling not the rictus of fear I felt frozen on my actual face, but something knowing, something complicit. The camera recorded everything. I spent the next morning reviewing the footage, frame by frame, my academic training asserting itself in the face of impossibility. The woman's appearance was instantaneous. No fade, no distortion, simply absence followed by presence. For exactly 1 hour, she stood beside my bed, breathing in that measured way that had become the soundtrack to my nights. But it was a detail. In the mirror that sent me stumbling to the bathroom to vomit up my morning coffee. In the reflection, partially visible behind my smiling doppelganger, was a small white rectangle. When I enhanced the image, I could just make out the text. St. Jude's Hospital. Psychiatric ward. Patient number 311. The photograph on the ID card showed the woman's face, exactly as it had appeared beside my bed. I spent the next 3 weeks in a researched frenzy that would have impressed my doctoral advisors. The city public library's microfiche room became my second home, its antiquated machines humming with a sound that reminded me uncomfortably of the breathing in my bedroom. The room itself was a temporal anomaly of sorts, unchanged since the 1970s, with its metal filing cabinets and flickering fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows on the institutional green walls. Mrs. Chen, the head research librarian, initially regarded my requests with professional detachment. But as my inquiries grew more specific, hospital records from the 1920s, architectural plans for St. Jude's original psychiatric ward, newspaper articles about missing persons who had last been seen watching others sleep, her manner shifted subtly. She began leaving relevant materials on my preferred desk before I arrived each morning, though I had never told her my schedule. "You're not the first, you know," she said one evening as I was packing up my notes. The statement was delivered casually, but something in her tone made me pause. Every few decades, someone comes in here looking for the same information. They all have that look about them, like they're seeing things that exist just at the edge of normal perception. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, studying me with an intensity that made me wonder if she, too, had encountered something that defied conventional explanation. Hospital records from that era were fragmentary at best, many lost to fires, floods, or simple bureaucratic negligence. But newspapers proved more illuminating, their yellowed pages preserving fragments of history that institutions had chosen to forget. I developed a system for my search, working backward from my own incident at the museum, looking for patterns in dates, times, and locations. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows through the reading room's high windows. I had been examining a series of small articles from 1922, each describing seemingly unrelated incidents at various city hospitals. The pattern emerged slowly, patients and staff reporting strange breathing sounds in the night, unexplained scents. Lily of the Valley was mentioned more than once, and mirrors that seemed to reflect impossible spaces. And then I found it, a small article dated March 11th, 1922, tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of society weddings. The headline was modest: "Missing Patient Prompts Investigation at St. Jude's." But it was the details that made my hands shake so badly, I had to set down my coffee cup. The patient had been admitted to St. Jude's, the new psychiatric ward, for what they termed acute temporal displacement disorder, a diagnosis I had never encountered in any of my medical research. She had been found wandering the hospital corridors, At night, standing over sleeping patients, breathing in what witnesses described as an almost ritualistic manner, the description matched exactly what I had been experiencing, down to the precise rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. When confronted by hospital staff, she had spoken of collecting moments of consciousness and insisted that time is more fluid than they know. The article went on to detail her theories about certain objects, mirrors primarily, serving as focal points where time could pool and eddy, like water in a stream. The medical staff had dismissed these ideas as delusions, but something about them resonated with my mother's research notes, still tucked behind the frame of my Victorian mirror. The patient had escaped during the night shift, but that wasn't what sent a chill down my spine. It was the accompanying photograph of the orderly who had last seen her. My own face stared back at me from the grainy newsprint, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow. The name listed beneath could have been my own grandfather's, but I knew with a certainty that defied logic that it was me I was looking at. Even the way he stood, one shoulder slightly higher than the other, a habit my physical therapist was always trying to correct, matched my own posture exactly. I spent hours cross-referencing the article with other sources, building a timeline that seemed to fold back on itself like a Mobius strip. The psychiatric ward's original blueprints revealed that the patient's room had been in the exact location where, decades later, they would install the morgue where I had been working the night of my attack. The hospital's admission records showed that she had been brought in at 3:11 a.m. on a night when the moon was in the same phase as it had been during my own admission. More disturbing still were the small details that seemed to repeat throughout the decades. Every few years, someone at St. Jude's would report similar phenomena, always between 3:11 and 4:11 a.m., always accompanied by the scent of lily of the valley, always involving mirrors or reflective surfaces that seemed to show more than they should. Each incident had been carefully documented and then, just as carefully, forgotten, filed away in archives that few people knew existed. The next night, I waited for her. The camera remained unplugged. I had begun to suspect that documentation was beside the point, perhaps even counterproductive. Some truths resist objective observation, existing instead in the spaces between what we think we know and what we fear to discover. The Victorian mirror seemed especially active that evening, its surface rippling occasionally like disturbed water. Though the air in my bedroom remained perfectly still, Bruno had abandoned his usual post by the door and lay instead beneath the mirror, his eyes tracking movement that I could only catch glimpses of in my peripheral vision. At precisely 3:11 a.m., when the breathing started, I spoke without opening my eyes. The words emerged with a certainty that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, as if I were reading from a script I had written in another lifetime. "I know who you are," I said to the darkness. My voice sounded strange in my ears, as if it were reaching me from multiple temporal distances simultaneously. "I know what you're doing." The breathing paused. The silence that followed felt heavy with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then, in a voice that sounded like pages turning in a forgotten book, she responded, "No, you know. Who you are, you've always known." I opened my eyes. She stood there, as always, but now her hand was extended toward me, palm up. On it lay my St. Jude's Hospital ID badge from the night of my attack, except the date read 1922, and the photograph showed me in an orderly's uniform, standing against a backdrop that belonged to another century. The image seemed to shift slightly as I looked at it, sometimes showing me as I appeared now, sometimes as I had been then, sometimes as I would be in moments yet to come. "Time isn't what they think it is," she said, her breath carrying the sweet, familiar scent of lily of the valley. Each word seemed to echo not just in the room, but across decades. rippling outward through layers of reality like stones dropped in still water. It pulls, it eddies. Sometimes it catches us in its currents. Sometimes we choose to swim in it. The mirror behind her had become something else entirely, a window opening onto countless versions of my bedroom, each one slightly different, each one occupied by variations of myself in different stages of understanding. Some were still sleeping peacefully, unaware of what was about to happen. Others were sitting up, watching us with knowing expressions. Still others were already standing, ready to step through the glass into whatever lay beyond conventional temporality. In the mirror, my reflection nodded, still wearing those anachronistic scrubs, and suddenly I remembered everything. The night rounds in 1922, finding her standing over patients, the recognition in her eyes when she saw me, not just as I was then, but as I would be, as I had been, as I would always be. The chase through the hospital corridors that ended not with her capture, but with a choice. The attack in the museum, I said slowly, understanding blooming like a night-flowering vine. I did it to myself to ensure I would receive the titanium plate, the one that resonates at exactly the right frequency, to SOR, to let you see through time, she finished, to let you remember, to help you understand why your mother left. She saw it too, you know, the way consciousness flows between moments like water through cupped hands. Bruno had stopped his silent snarling. He padded over to us and sat calmly, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. In the mirror, my reflection began to multiply, showing versions of myself from different eras, different moments, all wearing that same expression of profound recognition. The choice comes again, she said. Stay here in this linear progression of moments, or she extended her hand once more. In the mirror, I watched as my current self reached for it, even as I felt my arm remain motionless at my side. The distinction between reflection and reality began to blur, like watercolors bleeding together in the rain. Why the breathing? I asked. One final question before whatever came next. She smiled, and it was my mother's smile, and my smile, and the smile of everyone who had ever understood what time really was. Breath is how we measure moments, she said, and moments are all we really are. I took her hand. In the mirror, my reflection remained in bed, watching as we faded away like morning mist. Outside, the city began to wake, unaware that in apartment after apartment, in moment after moment, we were standing over sleepers, breathing in their dreams, collecting consciousness like precious stones, swimming in the infinite pool of time, and somewhere, in every moment between 3:11 and 4:11 a.m., a dog howls at something his human masters cannot quite see, and a camera records nothing but static, and the scent of lily of the valley drifts through the air like a memory of what never was and always will be. The next morning, they found my bed empty, though I had never left it. In the mirror, my reflection sometimes waves to passers-by, though I am not there to wave. And in the basement of St. Jude's Hospital, in a dusty archive that technically doesn't exist, there is a photograph of an orderly from 1922 standing next to a patient in a high-necked gown with delicate lacework at the collar. We are both smiling. We are both breathing. We are both exactly where we chose to be. And if you wake at 3:11 a.m. to the sound of breathing beside your bed, keep your eyes closed, or don't. The choice, as always, is yours. Just know that somewhere in the infinite reflections of time, you've already made it.